Welcome to this Charm at the University of Winchester event, organised for the 2020 Winchester Heritage Open Days Festival. Today's event will be a West Hill Cemetery look behind the scenes, led by Dr Christina Welch. This presentation will provide a historical overview of the cemetery and highlight some of the notable graves. We hope that you enjoy.
Hi, so my name's Dr Christina Welch and I'm going to be giving you a brief rundown on the history of Winchester's West Hill Cemetery. So the project at West Hill is a research project that's quite interdisciplinary. It involves staff and students in history, archaeology and religious studies in collaboration with Winchester City Council. We also have some students and staff from digital media who are helping us develop a better website than the one we already have. The project was initiated by General Sir Gary Johnson, who is a city resident and who was concerned about the state of the graveyard, and approached the university because it's a walkway really between the city and the university by staff and students. So just a brief overview, the cemetery was opened in 1840, it was opened by the Winchester Cemetery Company, and in 1953 it was taken over by the City Council. New burials had largely ceased well before that time actually, but it's not a closed cemetery. If you already have a plot there, it is possible to have an interment. There was a real problem by the 1830s, a nationwide problem to do with the dead around the country. The populations had exploded. You can see in 40 years there's an explosion in population, just over 6,000 between 1811 and just shy of 10,000 in 1841. And the city had to cope with the barracks, the county hospital and also the county prison. But as you can see from the date on these, when the burial registers end from a few churches in the city, by the 1830s, the cemeteries were filling up, and that would include the graveyard at the front of the cathedral, which was also full by that time. So it was a real problem, and with an increasing population as a city and a lack of burial space, things were a bit of a concern. So what happened was that notice was given and an Act of Parliament was allowed for some land to be bought and for the Winchester Cemetery Company to be able to purchase some land up on West Hill, a little bit of land from the London and South Western Railway Company and some land that was owned by the cathedral, and that would be made into a cemetery. So in 1839, private shares were sold and we had a range of directors. You can see from this list here, it's pretty much the city's great and good. It was initiated as an idea by a gentleman called Charles Benny, who was actually from Portsmouth. And Act of Parliament by royal assent was given for the graveyard on the 23rd of March 1840. At the time, it had two chapels, both designed by Owen Brown Carter, who at the cottage of which you can still see today is of a very similar design. And it was a very popular cemetery and consequently filled up quite quickly, which is a real concern. And we'll see this shortly in some photographs. So these are the deeds of two parts of land. And on top of this, you can see at the bottom some land that was purchased from the railway. That's largely where the cottage is situated today. And these are the two fields that were bought that enabled the cemetery company to purchase and build the cemetery. So this is a photograph of the Anglican chapel, at the time known as the Episcopalian chapel. We think these photographs were taken around about 1890, but it's not really clear. But the cemetery was consecrated and the Anglican chapel consecrated on the 11th of November 1840. So within a few years you can see that the chapel is fairly covered with ivy. You can also see that within about 40-50 years there's an awful lot of graves. This is another view of the chapel. You can see some more graves here. The tall obelisk at the front is still existent. I'll talk a little bit more about this. We think this photograph is possibly slightly later because the chapel is far more covered in ivy. But sadly, we don't actually have dates for these chapels. We do know that they were demolished in the 1920s though. And this is a view of the reverse of the Anglican chapel. We think this is probably taken at the same time as the first photograph that I showed you, so slightly earlier than the hugely ivy covered one. But what you can see here again is a large number of graves, a large number of memorials. And this is the Nonconformist Chapel, at the time known as the Dissenters Chapel. You can see it's a lot smaller, and I will show you on some maps where this was located. You can see from this that it is very similar in style to the cottage, and again that's something I will talk about a little later. So the first burial on the consecrated side of the cemetery was shortly after the cemetery opened. So it opened in November and the first burial was in November, and it was to a Henrietta Price. You can see here she is the top on this list of the burial registers. On the unconsecrated site, we have somebody buried in January 1841, and her name was Jane Neve, and she comes from Christchurch actually, and was an educationalist, which is quite interesting because what is now the University of Winchester and was then the Diocesan Training School actually opened in the same year that the cemetery was founded. So there's quite a nice link there between the university and the cemetery in terms of education. Now this is one of the very early maps of the cemetery. So this is an Ordnance Survey map from 1874. And I'll come back to this a little bit later, but what it shows you is the lodge. You can see that very clearly marked in pink. And you can see the two chapels as pink squares. And what's separating them is sort of a bit like a dog-legged line, which was actually a wall that separated the Anglican, the larger area, from the non-Anglican area. You'll also see some walks on this map. Pay attention to those because I will go through how these change in the next few slides. Also note in the top corner where St James's Lane and Sparkford Road meet, because that's changed layout, and I'll talk a little bit more about that too. But we can see here that what you have is a map from 1874 showing the cottage, two chapels and a wall separating the two areas. This map is 1894, and we can see here that we have the two chapels still marked and the walks are still there, but the wall has gone by this point. We don't know when the wall was taken down. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's interesting to note that the wall had vanished by 1894. This is a 1908 map. As you can see, the walks have slightly changed, but the two chapels are still marked on the map. If we move to this map though, 1931, you can see that the walks have changed very slightly, but the most dramatic change is that the chapels have gone. As we said, we do know that they were removed in the 1920s at some point. And again, I will show you a little bit of information, particularly relating to where the Dissenters Chapel was. You'll be able to see that quite clearly. So this just gives you a rough idea of the amount of burials that were on the site. There's approximately 22,500 people buried at West Hill Cemetery. The red marks the unconsecrated burials and the blue is the consecrated burials. Largely the cemetery was full really pretty much by the sort of 1920s, and you can see a sharp spike where the Spanish flu had a lot of influence on the numbers of deceased. So you can see here that the cemetery was really very popular. From between 1840 and sort of let's go up to about 1900, you can see that there's a lot of burials. So the cemetery is really, really filling up. And once you have a grave, you have it for perpetuity. So the amount of income that's coming into the cemetery company obviously started dying off, and this caused some problems. So by the 1940s, we find some reports, first about William Whiting's grave. He's the gentleman who wrote Eternal Father Strong to Save, which is the naval hymn, talking about how you can eat blackberries off his grave. And then a letter to a newspaper talking about a gentleman who visited a family grave. He's an American gentleman, but didn't want to take photographs of where their relative was buried because it was in such a bad state and it would really upset the rest of the family back in America. And if you take a look at this map, you can see why. So what we have here is, it's very difficult to see, but basically as the cemetery started filling up, the grave company, the cemetery company, had to start laying graves alongside the paths. So we have some huge areas that are very densely populated. The sparsely populated areas are where we think what would be the pauper graves would be. I'll talk a little bit more about that, and there's some information on the website. It's a bit of an ongoing project trying to locate these pauper graves. But you can see where the popular areas were, which is around the walks. And one of the reasons for that was it was customary in Victorian times to go to church. And then after that, you would sort of parade, really. You would go out for a walk, maybe go out for a picnic. And it was not unusual to go out to a cemetery. It was a beautiful spot. If you go up to the cemetery today, you can look out over the South Downs. It really is absolutely stunning on a nice clear day, regardless of whether it's the summer or the winter. So it was a very popular place to be buried for all sorts of reasons. But by the 1940s, it was getting to be a real problem. And this was taken in the 1950s. This map was made, and we think this was made either just before or just after it was taken over by Winchester City Council. By the 1950s, Henrietta Price's grave, you can see here that there's actually a spelling mistake in the Hampshire Chronicle, was in pretty poor state, and it is now lost to us. We don't actually know where Henrietta Price was buried, and it was frost damage, but it was actually removed because of that. However, we do still have in the cemetery the grave to Jane Neave, so the first person to be buried in the unconsecrated area of the cemetery. It was once a very tall obelisk. It's now fallen, but you can very clearly see its location. In the bottom photograph, you can see the cross of sacrifice there. Now, the cross of sacrifice is opposite where the non-conformist chapel would have been. So the cemetery then is very full, and Winchester Cemetery Company had stopped making any money. It was very difficult because they had no money to tend the graves, and because it was in such a bad state, the council had to take it over. It's a long and complicated story because actually no provision had been made when the cemetery had been set up for the cemetery to be passed into other hands, but it was required another Act of Parliament for this to happen. And in the next set of photographs, you can see some before the council cleared the site, after the council cleared the site, and some photographs that my colleague and I have taken over the last few years. So you can see how many of the graves are actually, or the memorials are actually missing. As I noted, there's about 22,500 people there. We think at its height there was about 9,000 memorials. So here you can see some photographs taken in 1953, and as you can see, it's a pretty derelict site that's very, very overgrown. You can't see very many of the graves. They're really hidden by brambles and by bushes. This is another photograph. It's really difficult to actually even locate realistically where some of these photographs have taken, but you can see that it's fairly dense in terms of rough grass and brambles. So the council decided that it was in such a state that they did need to clear this. So this is the first of a series of before and after photographs. So we see here 1953 and then what it looked like in 1958. So you can see how many of the gravestones were actually hidden behind all of that undergrowth. And here's another. This is up against the wall. This is the wall against Sparkford Lane. The walls are actually Grade 2 listed. The cottage, strangely, isn't, but the walls are actually listed. But you can see here very clearly how much the undergrowth was covering the memorials, and not just the standing memorials, but as you can see, some laying stones as well. This is another one along by the wall, and this is looking down, again, looking down towards Sparkford Road, which would be on your right-hand side. and another photograph, and yet another photograph. So as you can see, from 1953, the council did an awful lot of work to maintain the cemetery and to try and bring it back to some sort of decent state. But you can imagine, because of the neglect over the intervening years before the 1950s, before they took the cemetery over, many of the graves were not in a particularly good state and of course have continued to deteriorate. So here we see the same after photograph, 1958, and what it looks like today in terms of the graves that are there. So you can see the covered urn at the top and a couple of the crosses. All of the rest of those graves have gone. And they have fallen into a really bad state of disrepair. So part of our project is to try and recover as much information as we can about the graveyard and also record for posterity what's there before more gets lost. So here's another one. So we have 1953, 1958, and then 1958 and today. And again, you can see that there's a lot of graves that are missing. And again, 1953, 1958, and the colour photograph shows what is currently extant, what is currently there. And this is a really interesting set of photographs. So again, this is from 1953. You can see what's the Gosling cross, the large cross. Just behind the cross and to the left-hand side is a large tree, and that marks roughly the entranceway to where the Anglican chapel would have been. This is the same shot in 1958. And this is what's left now. So you can see, again, a huge change. An awful lot of memorials, sadly, have just been lost to the weather, some of it to vandalism too. And here we have again, 1953, 1958. So you can see this is looking down towards the bottom wall where we think an awful lot of the poor were buried, people who couldn't afford memorials, and we're actually, as I said, going to do some work along there, seeing if we can locate, using geophysics, some grave boundaries. So we have some archaeology students working with us at the moment under the auspices of some archaeologists to really try and help us understand where the poorer people of the city were buried. And this is what it's like today. It's very overgrown. Most of these memorials are no longer extant at all. And this is a really interesting telling shot that manages to fit on all three. So you can see Christchurch here, and you can really clearly see how many memorials have actually been lost. It was quite difficult to try and tie up exactly the location, but I think you can see here that an awful lot of graves from that middle photograph are missing. So our initial project was to map the extant memorials. So that's the memorials that we could see. And each of the little dots on this particular map, which is based on the original map that I showed you, are where extant memorials are. There's probably still a few more because there's quite a few ivy bushes in the cemetery, and we know that there's probably memorials in there, but they're just completely covered, sadly. So I now want to take you on to some points of interest within the cemetery, which will probably tell you a little bit more, rather than just about the history, tell you a little bit of the story of the graveyard, and things that you might find quite interesting if you were going for a walk. So first off, when we were looking at this 1874 map, I suggested that you have a look at the corner of St James Lane and Sparkford Road. The photograph shows what it looks like now, and the map shows what it looked like back in the day. But in the 1980s, it was deemed a real traffic hazard, having that very sharp corner. So the corner was cut off of the graveyard. And this meant that there had to be a disinterring of one grave. And that happened to be a vault. So the grave was opened, emptied, and the body relocated, the vault filled in, and the side taken off of the graveyard. And it's really obvious when you go up and take a look, because you can see a complete change in the fence structure. Looking at that 1874 map, I now want to move on to the map in the city. So if you go to the City Museum you'll find that there is a map of Winchester, and this is the area that it shows West Hill Cemetery, and it's obviously taken from that 1874 map. You can see quite clearly the cottage with a large area of garden. A lot of that was taken up later on, sort of round about the 1920s when the cemetery was really full. It was taken over and used predominantly for Anglican burials, although there is a small area of nonconformist burials. You can see both chapels and you can see a scattering of grave markers, just to give an idea. But you can also see in front of the doors to both of the chapels where an area would be for people to wait. And as I'd mentioned before, opposite the non-Anglican, so that's known as the Dissenters' Chapel, is where the Cross of Sacrifice is today. Now this wall is really interesting because actually we don't have any photographs whatsoever of the wall because it disappeared by the late 1870s, and the photographs that we have of the chapels are just of the chapels, nothing else. But if you go to the cemetery on a really warm summer's day where there's been very little rain, you'll notice that behind the Cross of Sacrifice, and a little bit further, depending on where you are, which direction you're looking, you'll find a line in the grass, and this actually marks the original wall. And if you look carefully, you can see some stones. This photograph of a close-up of the stones shows that there's tree roots growing over them, so we know that this is the original wall. As you can see, they're rounded on the top. We can't tell by looking how the wall actually looked, but clearly it couldn't have just been these very low stones. That really wouldn't have fitted in. And we think that it was possibly like the wall, the boundary wall to the actual cemetery. So what you see here is the entrance, the original entrance to the cemetery. And if you look carefully, you can just see that what you have is every few stones, you have a post, and the actual metal bit stretches across the top, so there's a little bit of a gap. And we think that's what the wall would have looked like, that it wasn't actually a solid wall. But we do actually need to sort of clear some of the dirt off the top of what we can find left of the wall to see if we can find these stones with holes in them, which is where the metal would have fixed. Now this was the only original entrance to the cemetery. The one over by the university was opened much later, and it was put in and tarmacked over really in the 1980s, 1990s. So the up to about where the Cross of Sacrifice is, very slightly beyond, is part of the original wall, the original path rather, that dates to the 1840s. And after that Cross of Sacrifice, that pit that goes to the university is actually far more recent. Now, when the cemetery was opened, in the cottage was a sexton, and the sexton had a number of duties. And what's highlighted here is that, and you can see this in blue, one of the duties of the sexton was to take charge of a large dog provided and maintained by the directors to be placed near graves where bodies have been recently interred at night. And the reason for that was because of grave robbing. Now, Charles Benny, who's one of the guys, he was the main founder really, he was the main initiator of the cemetery project, but his sister had died and been buried in Portsmouth and sadly had been grave robbed. So when the cemetery was set up, there was a real understanding that even though the Anatomy Act had been brought in at this time, it was possible that some graves could be robbed in order for them to go to anatomists or possibly even to go to museums. And I'm not entirely sure if this is actually what I think it might be, but on the wall by the cottage, you can see just highlighted in blue is what looks to me like somewhere where the dog would be chained up. I might be wrong, but I'm sort of thinking that it could very well be at night that this is where the dog was chained up to stop potential grave robbers entering into the cemetery. If you actually look at that metal chain, you'll see that it's really very worn. Now, grave robbing is something that we're not sure happened. This is the obelisk, and I mentioned that this obelisk was still you could still see it from the first photographs that I showed of the Anglican chapel. And this obelisk is to a gentleman by the name of Charles Freeman. Now, Charles Freeman was a bare knuckle boxer, a pugilist. And the memorial that we see today was raised by John Heenan in July 1860. And John Heenan was a very famous bare knuckle boxer. Originally, Freeman just had a lying slab. Now, Freeman arrived in England in 1842. He was brought over by Ben Caunt. Not sure whether that's the case, but there's an urban myth that that's what Big Ben is named after, Ben Caunt, the boxer. Now, on the 18th of October 1845, Charles Freeman died, as you can see from the death register, in Winchester Hospital. We don't know what he was doing in Winchester. It seems a very strange place to come to die, and we're pretty certain that he died of what's known as galloping TB, so very fast tuberculosis. 8 months prior to his death, he was 6'10" in height and weighed 21 stones, so he was a really big, powerful guy. He was admitted to hospital in the October, on 10 days before he died, and at death he actually only measured 6'7.5" and had gone down to 10 stone 1. So whatever had happened to him, it was very quick. It was 18 months. Now, at his prime, when he was exhibiting his strength in London and in Brighton, he could lift 1 ton in weight. And I found a wonderful story about him riding 2 horses bareback around a circus ring, holding a man above his head. So he was clearly a bit of a circus showman, not so much a great boxer, it has to be said, but he was obviously very strong and quite a figure. Now, the reason I mention grave robbing and Freeman is this. This we can see is some skeletons that are in the Hunterian Museum. And what we have here is Charles Byrne, who was 8'2" and known as the Irish Giant. Now, next to him, it says, the skeleton at left belonging to Charles Freeman, the 7'6" American giant. So we're not sure that this is Charles Freeman's skeleton. I'm waiting to try and get hold of the bones to be able to get them analysed to find out the height at his death, which we know was 6'7", and whether the musculature that's left, the sort of marks left on the skeleton, on the bones by the muscles, matches somebody who was very strong, and also whether his spine shows a form of TB. Because if it does, then actually there was grave robbing that happened at West Hill Cemetery. So watch this space. It might be a few years before we find this out, but it's quite an interesting story. But there's a number of other really interesting people who are buried at West Hill. Not foreigners, as Charles Freeman was, but local gentlemen. So here is Reverend Arthur Barron's Soul Memorial. It's also to his wife. Now, he really assisted the city's poor. He provided a burial cart to allow the city's poor to bring the bodies to the cemetery, and he was a real supporter of the poorhouse. He also helped found Winchester City Football Club and Southampton Football Club. So he was a real philanthropist, and he has a very small memorial, really, in comparison to possibly his status within the city. Another interesting memorial we have is actually to a Harrod. This is to Henry Digby Harrod, who was the son of the founder of Harrods in London. And Winchester had its own Harrods store at one stage. It's where Pret is in the High Street today. So that, again, is another really interesting memorial that we have, and he's buried with his wife. We also have a fascinating angel. Now, the angel commemorates a 3-month-old infant, George Hamilton Fletcher, who died in 1888, and the family owned Preshaw Park in the Meon Valley. There's 2 things that are particularly interesting, I think, about this angel. Firstly, we know from looking at the burial registers that there are some graves of children or infants that died, and because the family was poor, the body was put in the coffin of an unrelated adult. Also, there was very, very high infant mortality. So we have one absolutely stunning memorial for a child of a very wealthy family, knowing that there are an awful lot of children buried on site who have no memorials whatsoever. So I think this stands as an interesting testimony in terms of how social status works in any cemetery. There's another interesting story. It's believed that the gentleman who wrote Buffy, he went to Winchester College, got the idea for the story Buffy by wandering around a graveyard near to the college, and we're not sure, but we're kind of hoping that that might be West Hill. So if anybody's got any ideas on that, do let us know. We have a number of military graves. So here we have 2 graves to people who hold the Victoria Cross. So there's Brigadier Charles Foss, who, if you look very closely at the memorial, you can just make out some Japanese script at the bottom. He has Japanese connections. And we have here a VC to Colonel Francis David Millett Brown. We have this memorial, which is to 2 members of the Louth family, who both on the grave markers mention a number of Indian campaigns. We don't think that where these are actually located in the cemetery is actually where the original memorial was. We think when they were moved, they were probably taken and just moved elsewhere as opposed to just buried. But we need to try and find out a little bit more about the Louth family. And here is a rather stunning Celtic cross to a William Henry Forrest. Now, he was a member of the 11th Hussars and fought in a number of very notable battles. There's also a memorial to him in Winchester Cathedral, but this appears to be the place that he was actually buried as opposed to just memorialised. And we're not sure why he has a Celtic cross, but it's a lovely, lovely memorial, and it's very close to the angel that I showed you earlier. And here's a memorial to somebody who was in the Grenadier Guards. So we have a lot of different memorials, not just in terms of the shape and the size of the memorials, but also in terms of British history, really. History from 1840s right through to, well, we've got a couple of Second World War, Commonwealth War graves memorials, but pretty much they sort of run out round about the 1920s, I would say. 1930s, 1940s. There are a few later than that, but not many. So, but most of the graves we have then are Victorian memorials and some a little bit later. So this is quite an interesting memorial, and the reason that this is interesting is you can actually see it in this photograph of the Anglican chapel. So you can just about in the colour photograph note the tree, so that's behind it and to the left, and we think that that's probably about where the entrance to the chapel was. But it's a nice photograph in that we can actually situate the position of the Anglican chapel by using this grave. This is an archetypal Victorian memorial. This is to the Blake family. We, as yet, haven't been able to establish what their connection with Winchester was. It has a coat of arms on it, as you can see, but it has an urn that's covered by a cloth. Also, it has some upside down torches, and this was something that happened a lot in the Victorian times. The symbolism was often turned upside down to show that somebody had died, and you have a lot of broken columns or urns that are covered. So this is an archetypal Victorian memorial. Very elaborate at the top end of the graveyard, very close to where the wall was cut off. And it's a particular marker point, really, if you're walking around the cemetery. And this is one of my favourites. This is to Colonel Fraser, and it's an absolutely stunning cross that's decorated with a sword, and the detailing on the sword is absolutely superb. I'm going to come back to the Foss, the Fraser and the Forrester graves at the end. And there's no particular reason for choosing all of them with F, but it's something that I want to show you to do with the contemporary state of the graveyard. And this is the memorial to William Whiting. So this was the one that in the 1840s people were able to eat blackberries off. So him and his wife are buried here. He was a master at Winchester College, and he wrote the very famous naval hymn. So he's, as I've said, we've got some very interesting people, local people, buried in the cathedral. Not in the cathedral, sorry, in the cemetery. This is a memorial, or one of the many Masonic memorials. Well, there's actually two here. And first of all, I want to talk about the small complete memorial that you can see, in that it's smaller than the large column. So this is actually to the grave of Inspector Richard Tanner, who is an inspector in the Metropolitan Police. And he solved the first ever railway murder in the world. Because we had the first ever railway, unsurprisingly, we've had the first ever murder on a railway. So he found his suspect. His suspect fled to America in a sailing boat, but Tanner got onto a steamer and beat him to it, arrested him in New York, and brought the man back for a public hanging in London. And there were 50,000 people that watched. The story of this particular murder was published as a novel and was made into a straight-to-video film. It could very well be that the guy that was murdered didn't actually commit the crime. But it's a good story nonetheless, and it has on this memorial, you can just about see a Star of David. Now, the Star of David here is not a Jewish symbol. This is in the Anglican section of the graveyard. It's actually a Masonic symbol. And we have a lot of Masonic memorials, and probably the finest is this obelisk that you can see here, which has at the top of the obelisk, it has a number of Masonic symbols, including the eye, and around the bottom it has a number of Masonic symbols as well. So it's a pretty stunning memorial, and we do have a number of others. It's something that we're looking into is actually the Masonic graves within the cemetery. Another rather interesting memorial is this. This is actually up near the Blake Urn Memorial. And what we know about this is it's a memorial to 3 young children. It's rather unusual, rather lovely. We've got a lot to learn more about a lot of the people who are buried on the site, and this is one of the ones that we are particularly interested in. This is the Gosling Cross. It marks a vault for the Gosling family. We don't know very much about them. We do know that they were bankers in the city, and eventually the bank was taken over by Barclays. It's not full. Around the bottom of the cross, if you go and have a look, you'll see that not every one of the plaques has a name on it. And in the background, you can see the tree that marked where the chapel would have been. This is a really interesting memorial to somebody called Hayes Saint. We don't know much about them, but we do know that it's an unusual style, an unusual shape. It's in the area where the chapel would once have been. And it very much speaks to this idea that people were choosing memorials that represented stuff to do with them way back into the Victorian era. This idea about having modern funeral memorials, modern grave memorials that say something about you actually isn't that modern at all. We can actually find this quite a lot in our graveyard. So we have a couple of examples here. So a small Celtic cross and one that looks like a bit like, I guess, a window in a church. And another couple here. So we have a beautiful cross that's decorated with the vine, so Jesus being the vine of life. And one to a woman called Ella. This is down behind the cottage. So it's not easy to find if you're going for a walk in the cemetery. But if you're looking from the outside in between the railway line and where the cemetery cottage is, it's slightly leaning over, so you can often see that. And she's one of the women who are memorialised. Obviously her husband is mentioned, but she's buried here and her husband isn't. We have a number of Commonwealth graves. This one, the one that you're seeing on its own, is to a 15-year-old naval trainee, and he is very close to where the main area of the Commonwealth War Graves, Commission graves are, which are always beautifully kept. But we have these graves dotted around the cemetery, and you can also see one where the Commonwealth War Graves Memorial is part of a normal family memorial. I said there were a number of interesting stories around the graveyard, and this is one that we are really trying to dig into. So during the First World War, if you were not, or if you were a number of nationalities, but these here were German civilians who were interred, put into an internment camp in the city. And it appears that they died of the Spanish flu. If you look at the dates of death, you can see that they're all towards the end of 2018. They were all interred into West Hill Cemetery. One of the first things it appears that the German government did under the Hitler leadership was to give people who died during the First World War in a country that wasn't Germany grave markers. So at some stage we possibly had grave markers in the cemetery that were paid for by the Nazi government. We have no idea what happened to those, but these German civilians were eventually taken out of West Hill Cemetery and reinterred into Cannock Chase German Memorial Cemetery. It's a bit of a shame because they weren't actually military themselves, but they have all been interred together in plot 11, row 2. But it's one of the many interesting and sort of hidden stories that we have. Sadly, there's an awful lot of damage, not just the damage that was done really before the city council took over, but subsequently. There's been all sorts of reasons for this, one of which is just outright vandalism, and it's such a shame. You can see here in the two smaller photographs where some graves have been damaged, almost destroyed really. Memorials have been destroyed, and in the larger photograph that shows where the cross of sacrifice is, you can see that something's been knocked off. Now we don't know if this was during any form of grass cutting or whether this was just casual accidental damage, but certainly the cemetery is, yeah, it needs some tender loving care. So if anybody is interested, I'll give my details later, and it would be great if people could get in touch and we can try and get something sorted out with the council to try and look after this amazing cemetery that says such a lot about Winchester. It's very unusual to have a cemetery that has literally the great and the good as well as the poor. The cemetery took dead from what were known then as the lunatic asylums, the workhouse, the city's poor, and then we have the great and the good of the city as well as some famous people such as Charles Freeman. So I wanted to mention Foss, Forrester and Fraser, and because of COVID, obviously the council haven't been able to come up and look after the cemetery, and it really is in quite a bad state. So the Foss grave, as you can see, this is a gentleman with a VC. It's very overgrown. Forrester, you can hardly see at all. It's really overgrown by trees and vegetation. And the Fraser Memorial, that's one of my favourites, is very soon going to be swamped by ivy. It's really difficult to find. I will be liaising with the council once it's possible to get people up to the site to see if it's possible at least to cut back the ivy so that we can stop any further damage, because ivy is incredibly damaging to these memorials. But the council have done a fantastic job over the years in keeping the cemetery, and today it's largely kept by the council as a nature reserve. It's really to encourage this chalk grassland, particularly butterflies, because this is a habitat that is quite rare now, so it needs encouraging. So the site is only cut a couple of times a year, so they are aware that obviously there are some members of the city, some people in the city who would like it cut more often, but it's a case of balancing not just finances but also keeping the memorials that we actually have, looking after those memorials, but also making sure that it's a good habitat for biodiversity, because that's also something that's very important. So if you go up there and it looks a bit messy, do remember that it is a wildlife reserve, but we are trying to do what we can to preserve the history that's there. If you'd like to find out a little bit more about the site, there is a WordPress site. I am aware that there does appear to be a spelling mistake on here. I didn't set up this site. It does have a spelling mistake. We are hoping to get a better website sorted out. So, do keep an eye on this. It will eventually have a better site. And then if you typed in this, it would automatically go to it. You can either contact me at christina.welch@winchester.ac.uk, or you can send an email to westhillc@winchester.ac.uk, which myself and my colleague who is working, the main people working on the project, has access to. We can't locate graves for people, obviously, because we have full-time academic jobs. But we obviously are happy to hear from people, particularly anybody that would like to help us try and find out some more information, some genealogical research about the 22,500 people who are buried there. Anybody that might be interested in helping with the city council, perhaps cutting back some of the ivy. But the main thing that we would like to do is to set up a Friends of group. Now, my colleague and I are not able to set up a Friends group, not just because we don't actually have a huge amount of time, but if my colleague or I set it up as academics, we are then, the Friends Society is then prohibited from accessing certain forms of funding. So whilst we'd be willing to be part of a group, we can't be founding members and we can't hold any particular major positions, because it would be nice if we could get this started. We could then look for some finance for the site and try and make sure that it's kept to the best way it can. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. And at the moment, we're in the process of developing a walking leaflet, which will eventually be available through Winchester City Council. Hopefully that will be available by the end of the year or maybe springtime. And then you'll be able to pick up a bit of a leaflet and do a couple of walks around the cemetery if you feel like you'd like to. Both of them start from the cemetery cottage. One does a loop going up to where the angel and the big urn memorial is, and there's another loop that goes around by where the wall graves are, and you can see the grave of our own Harrods gentleman. So thank you very much for listening, and yeah, please get in touch if you'd like to help us out finding out more about this incredible cemetery in the city.
Thank you for tuning into this virtual Charm at the University of Winchester event made for the Winchester Heritage Open Days Festival. We hope that you enjoyed it. For further information and links, please look at our show notes, which you can find in this video's description and or on our Facebook page, Charm at the University of Winchester Volunteering. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section below or get in touch via our email or Facebook. For further details on this event and others put on for this year's Heritage Open Days Festival, please go to www.winchesterheritageopendays.org. We would really like to know your thoughts on this and our other events, so if you're able, we would really appreciate you completing an evaluation form, which you can find in the description box below. This will allow us to know what you enjoyed or help us improve our events for future festivals. All details of where to send the completed form can be found in the video's description or on our Facebook page. Thank you.